directamente relacionada a los resultados de los procesos que están siendo también debatidos en diferentes espacios internacionales, multilaterales, como Naciones Unidas, por supuesto, pero también los espacios otros, foros de seguimiento, y G20 es uno de ellos. También tenemos la rica participación de Federica Sigonello, que es nuestra advisor, nuestra experta para IPPF Global, que es nuestro punto focal para todos los temas relacionados a la conferencia de financiamiento para desarrollo. Y luego después espero tener la participación también de Foteini Papagiote, que nos representa como Women's Major Group, Grupo Mayor de Mujeres. Foteine tal vez logre entrar un poquito más tarde porque tuvo un problema personal con su hijo en la escuela y va a intentarse sumar a nosotras. Entonces, además de les dar la bienvenida y pedir que ponga sus nombres en el chat de la pantalla, quería solamente dar un pequeñito background sobre esa sesión porque pienso que muchos estuvieron en la última sesión, pero para quien no estuvo, estamos desde IPPF Acro, Gestos y el Grupo Mayor de Mujeres IPPF Global, estamos muy interesados en que más organizaciones que trabajan con género y que trabajan con salud se sumen en los procesos de incidencia para esa conferencia. Entonces, estamos haciendo ese esfuerzo mucho para tener sesiones mucho más informativas de que necesariamente estratégicas en ese momento. Y tuvimos una primera sesión mes pasado donde Claudio y Federica nos informaron, nos contaron cómo estaban se armando los procesos. Y ahorita, en comecito de diciembre, tuvimos finalmente la segunda sesión preparatoria en Naciones Unidas. Entonces, esa sesión de ahora es para que Claudio y Federica nos actualicen sobre cómo fue esa sesión y que nos puedan también ayudar a pensar cómo nos organizamos para la tercera sesión preparatoria, y así seguiremos siempre compartiendo informaciones y pensando la mejor manera de tener una cuarta conferencia de financiamiento para desarrollo que lleve más en consideración nuestras agendas feministas, nuestra agenda de género y nuestra agenda de salud, porque salud es sin duda un tema que es transversal y es muy importante, principalmente después que tuvimos esa experiencia de COVID-19 que muestra cómo en situaciones agravadas de salud no es posible hacer avanzar los planes económicos. Entonces, quiero les dar otra vez la bienvenida e inmediatamente pedir a Claudio que inicie su presentación. Después que Claudio y Federica nos hablen, vamos a abrir para comentarios, para preguntas, y les invito a todos a se sumar con nosotras. Muchas gracias. Bienvenido, Claudio. Tienes la palabra. Gracias.
Thank you, Alessandra. I'm going to speak in English because most of my notes are in English. That's going to facilitate. I hope it's acceptable. Good. So, second meeting for the Financing for Development Conference. Okay, the fourth Financing for Development Conference. That's going to happen in Sevilla, Spain, in the end of June, beginning of July. 2025, 10 years after the conference in Addis Ababa, the third conference in Addis Ababa. It's very interesting because while a few countries and civil society for a while, for 3 to 4 years, have been asking for a fourth conference on financing for development, during that process of demanding and recommending the realization of the conference and the process of negotiation of the conference. Many countries at that time, including Brazil, was kind of skeptical about the moment to have the conference because of the different scenario of geopolitics and the political context of many countries that have changed since then, since 2015. Many people actually doubt that the Paris Agreement today would be signed, or like as it was before, and as well as the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. It would be a very hard to get consensus on those agendas. But in the preparation for the fourth conference is showing actually a little bit of that reality. Many countries have turned to very polarized, strict type of political position in the world stage, and that is influencing their demands during the FFD preparatory committee meetings. And that is creating a situation where the hegemony of certain positions is just so strong, and it's being expressed so strongly that it affects the negotiations process. But this second meeting had the elements paper, okay? The elements paper was put together by 4 co-facilitators that was appointed by the 2 co-chairs of the conference. The 2 co-chairs are Burundi and Portugal, and the 4 co-facilitators, Nepal, Zambia, Norway, and Mexico, okay? Organized more than 300 submissions and created the elements paper that was discussed during the second meeting. Several issues came about, too much and too many to talk in here, but let's focus on a few very important ones. One is the tax issue, okay, and the spillover of the G20 tax on high net worth individuals, going to also the discussions on the FFD, and many countries asking for that, for the process of incorporating that type of tax and more innovative taxing mechanisms. Bunker fuels, excise tax on products, like tobacco as usual, but sodas and other type of junk food. So that was also brought about during the discussions. But the focus on tax was very much on the Framework Convention on Tax Cooperation. There's a lot of bets on that, but it's always good to remind that this Framework Convention is on tax cooperation, not necessarily establishing tax rules, but tax recommendations on how countries can cooperate with each other. So it has a limited effect. And that's one of the things that is being discussed quite a bit, on putting a lot of effort on that tax cooperation. Situation of political polarization brings about something that I believe Federica is going to talk complement quite a bit, which is the dispute on gender and women and binary situation, and being very explicit by several countries saying, no, we don't recognize the word gender. It's not approved language, and we should not insist in that type of dispute. Another issue very important is debt. And here's where health comes to play a big part, because health is being used as one of the possible benefits of the debt situation. So several countries ask for a debt workout mechanism, something that has never happened in a very inclusive way. Most of the discussions have been on the G20, OECD type of separate, discussions, not at the UN level. So they ask for a UN-based debt workout mechanism that could negotiate, bring together creditors and debtors in the discussion, and set up basic rules for the whole process of loans and debt, overall sovereign debt base, most likely. And here's one interesting aspect of that, is that debt swaps have been used many times. A lot of people criticize as calling it false solution, but in some cases, negotiated with transparency, it can bring resources towards the healthcare sector, and that's what a few countries have talked about. You know, debt for health, debt for nature as well as another mechanism, not as a solution for the debt process, but as a possible extra liquidity for solving specific issues, you know, and bringing resources to those sectors that needs a lot. And it comes into the discussion then how to convey those resources to those sectors through the multilateral development banks, national development banks. The Elements paper talked quite a bit about a way of even countries that do not have national development banks establishing national development banks and creating a national platform for financial disbursement, you know, because even if you can collect all the resources necessary for sustainable development, now been, you know, pretty much in the range between $3 to $4 trillion a year, how to disburse that, how to have projects to actually implement those systems and those assemblages that can actually create the sustainable development transition paradigm is something that has not been solved yet. A lot of the resources very much stay in the banks. There was one moment in the meeting that somebody talked about $11 trillion sitting in the multilateral development bank ledgers, meaning, you know, not being spent. And many times what the representatives of the World Bank says is that not enough bankable projects. And then he creates this paradigm of not enough bankable projects of a large size that those banks are interested in. But then how can you actually create a system where projects, smaller projects, can be also managed and finance can be directed towards those smaller projects? And that's an interesting aspect that came about, which is the discussion of the microeconomics of financing sustainable development. Not only the macroeconomics of it, but the microeconomics. And that's when gender comes into play, and that would be, you know, specific policies regarding groups. And another group that actually came about in the discussion, in this case, it was by invitation overall, and it got engaged in the engagement of Guedes from Brazil, which is the Institute of Black Women of Brazil, and it brought the whole anti-racist economies also into the discussion. And this was a spillover from the C20 discussions of microeconomics and fair, inclusive, anti-racist economies into some of the positions of the FFD mechanism. And in the sense of the process of the discussion. And it was supported by Brazil, you know, in a very good faith process. But gender, very much a point of content of very much contestation, and health being used as a way of justifying the mechanism of resolution for debt, so we can free fiscal spaces for the countries. They can invest in that. One question, though, and I'm here finished with this, is the discussion of national politics, which don't come into the fold, but we have to remember also that many times countries have fiscal space and also decide not to invest in the basic healthcare and education from the public point of view. And I finished with the fact that the hegemony of the private sector investment and the private sector narrative is still very much in place. And as a matter of fact, it creates a problem of bringing the private sector into the discussion, into the fold. So far, in 2 meetings of the PrepCom, there was no presence of the private sector whatsoever. But in a sense, what I observed is that so many countries already have the private sector defense in their narratives that somehow it's not even necessary to have the private sector in the room, because they're already being defended by so many countries that are open for business, and most of the public sector being seen as catalysts to attract private sector capital. to finance sustainable development. So those are the points of contestation, points of discussion. Many countries very radically against some of these aspects of democratization of economy, and particularly a lot of developed countries speaking against the whole proposal of more taxing. So these are pretty much the scenario. I'll finish here, and we can have more discussion later.
Claudio, just before giving the floor to Federica, can you tell a little bit more about the care economy aspect? And because I know Justus put forward a paper, an element paper suggestion for that, can you just to give us also to include that in the conversation?
Yes. Yeah, very quickly. There was an interesting thing on the proposal that Justus made was on the data and monitoring, okay, before the elements paper, and that was defended. I defended that on the Addis Ababa meeting in the end of July, which was the first preparatory committee meeting for the FFD4, and I made the case of the Spotlight report, that is produced by the Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda, and the fact that the SDGs have indicators, and that FFD should also have specific indicators, to follow up and monitor better the conference. And so the forum does not discuss only on positions and opinions, but it would have very specific indicators to discuss on. One of these indicators that needs visibility is the care economy, because it's one of the backbones of the overall economy. But most of the care economy, or a big part of the care economy, we don't have the information precisely, but that is invisible, and because it's not monetized, it's unpaid. Since it's unpaid, how it can be calculated? And one of the suggestions that was made was actually to include into the new Beyond GDP index. Okay, the Beyond GDP index was all proposed at the Pact of to the Future. After the Summit of the Future, one of the proposals that in 1 year is going to be presented to the Secretary General, a new index that is supposed to replace GDP and GDP per capita. And the recommendation is actually to include the care economy into that index. And not only the care economy, but also environmental preservation and other aspects, but mostly the invisibility of that, without necessarily financializing the care economy, but bringing some sort of value added to the economy that can be, visible. And that needs to be created by the experts. And so the discussion during the second preparatory meeting, this was accepted actually in the elements paper. This recommendation was accepted, elements paper. Several countries supported the idea, and a few countries just did not like the idea that this should be prepared by the interagency task force and the FFD office. There should be an intergovernmental discussion to come up with those indicators. But those indicators will be very important to do a better monitoring of the FFD conference. Thank you, Alessandra.
Oh, thank you, Claudio. I think this is quite an interesting start for the process, because the both requests for having monitoring and indicators and targets also, and also the GDP, going beyond the GDP, and also the care economy, that we need to have data about it, was also things that came out from the G20. So I think there is somehow, let's say, at least a train for more alignment on that. And I think it is a good start, right? And with that, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Federica, which is our focal point for IPPF in this conversation. Welcome, Federica. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and thanks for having me again today. I really appreciate you and the opportunity to have this more sort of like, you know, these platforms to share learnings and insights and highlights from these opportunities, specifically from the second PrepCom in this case. So I just wanted to sort of like make a connection to what we said last time. Since then, as Claudio and Alessandra had mentioned, obviously the Elements paper has been published, and as you might remember, I don't know if some of you were there during the first meeting, but at the time we sort of like presented the recommendations of IPPF and Countdown 2030 Europe, which is also you know, a project that I support. We both sort of like put forward some recommendations around gender and SRHR and how this could be included in the Elements paper. A quick overview of, you know, the more general objectives that we suggested and recommended at the time. Obviously, that was to promote reforms in the international financial architecture that really aligns with the principles of gender equality and human rights, ensuring sustainable and equitable development outcomes, recognize universal access to SRHR for all women and girls, really as the basis for women and girls empowerment, promote gender-responsive budgeting and financing strategies across all sectors to facilitate comprehensive support for women's health and economic participation. And finally, really encouraging partnership amongst governments to private sectors and civil society to really foster innovative financing solutions for gender equality, and that really address the challenges faced by women and girls, especially in marginalized communities. Now, this is sort of like a very brief, you know, overview of what we put forward as recommendation. The Elements paper came out, and Claudia just gave us some remarks on the Elements paper. I just wanted to sort of like have you know, provide a bit of an overview of what some of the highlights in terms of like mentioning of gender and gender equality in the Elements paper have been. Before really moving towards what happened, at least from my point of view at the PrepCom, you know, around gender and SRHR. Unfortunately, most of the conversation, well, not unfortunately, actually, that's not the right word. Gender is there, and I'm going to give some insight. SRHR, however, the SRHR element has not been as strong or not at the same level, at least. Overall, member states, you know, from an analysis of member states' inputs to the Elements papers, 2/3 of these submissions, only 60% of the member states submission, so 27 out of 45 submission, really included at least one mention of gender equality or women in their, again, Elements paper submission. There is some concern that 18 out of 45 submissions, both individual member states and group submission, did not include a single mention of gender equality or women. And particularly amongst the 10 submissions by groups or member states, there was only one mentioned, only one of these mentioned women, which is the African Union, in the context of supporting productive employment and access to cheap finance. Out of the 70 members of the G20, who submitted inputs, only 15 included at least one reference to women and or gender equality, but there were 4 who did not include any reference to it. And then finally, this is sort of like the strongest, obviously, the strongest inputs came from the countries that are members of the feminist foreign policy groups, and they played a significant role, you know, in submitting the strongest inputs to it. I just saw Yvonne's question around the sources for this, so I will share it later, Yvonne. So this is an analysis. The data for this taken from an analysis of the Walking the Talk consortium about the gender element in the Elements paper. So I can share the document with you all after. So in this context, going back to the feminist foreign policy group, in this context, you know, 8 out of 10 FFP plus countries mention gender equality or women and girls. And with this, I want to connect to what also happened at the PrepCom, what we've seen at the PrepCom in New York City, where obviously inputs from Spain, Mexico, and Colombia were also the strongest input and the strongest sort of like delegation during the PrepCom. Spain was really at the forefront with incredible and great statements on gender equality, and how this was important for the wider objective of the Financing for Development Conference. And Mexico, as one of the co-facilitator also, the co-facilitator also was really strong around the, in the conversations, in the statement, and their presence was really leading. And I also had the opportunity to, have a quick chat with the Mexico delegation, and they were really open to understand how we can better embed gender, hopefully in the zero draft and the zero draft of the outcome document of the conference. So I'm not going to go through the recurring themes and some of the, wider themes in terms of like the financial, as Claudio has mentioned a few of them already. I also wanted to mention the discussions around the tax systems reform, the tax system, the taxing the rich, and the big focus on the climate-related issues, etc. But I think what is some of the reflections of the different conversations that were there that happened at the conference, at the PrepCom. I think there was high question regarding the expectations of the outcome document in general, but also specifically for what concerns gender. So I've attended a meeting with the EU delegation, and while there was some opening, they were open to listen to how we could better embed gender in the outcome document. There were also some sort of like setting the expectation and the need for practical recommendation on the language, how we can do this better. So I think this is really important for us in terms of like next steps, especially as IPPF and Countdown 2030, on how we actually support member states in doing this. Yes, I agree with you, Claudio, about Argentina and also the Russian Federation. They were very vocal about their not supporting gender. So another consideration is that the document is expected to build on existing agreements rather than introduce entirely new frameworks, entirely new language. And I think this approach could either streamline the negotiations, but also limit the scope for actual transformation, specifically when it comes to language. On the positive side, established language can be a benchmark, for key issues, including gender equality. But then obviously we could aim to expand this. However, this is not really guaranteed. And actually, some delegations are really pushing back on new language or even want to remove old language. So this is really a risk. So there was a significant opposition from players such as the Russian Federation, as I just mentioned before. And also, I think there was a noticeable gap between what some countries and institutions expect from the process and what CSOs especially are advocating for. I think there is a bit of a gap. CSOs, not only on gender, but also on wider other issues, are really pushing for bold reforms and systemic change, which is, obviously what we all trying to achieve with this. But many delegations are really focused on more step-by-step adjustment and not really willing to engage on wider full reforms of international financial institutions and architecture. So how do we address this sort of like discrepancy? Another recurring theme was to agree on reforms of major financial institutions that should happen at UN level rather than, at institutional level, given that the wider representation of UN, given that there are more players, in the UN space. But there was some skepticism around this, around the actual feasibility of this sort of like approach. And then also there were some consideration, obviously, and some conversation around the representation and decision-making power for global majority countries within key international institutions, and also for what concerns gender equality. So really, how just how do we make this more balanced? How do we make representation more balanced? So in general, from the interactions that I had, and there is a call and a need to make more practical recommendations about gender. And in terms of like next steps for IPPF and Countdown 2030, we are currently defining the strategy on how to do so. But also I think it's very important to, another thing that I noticed is that there is a bit of fragmentation, especially within the group of feminist coalitions, feminist grassroots organizations, feminist groups that are trying to advocate for more for the inclusion, or for better inclusion of gender in the document and in this process. And so I think we need to use this very brief time to kind of like align and make sure that all the efforts from different parts of the world are really aligned, because I think we are there. We could probably have an impact, obviously, in the language and in what comes out of the zero draft, but it needs to come from a coherent and cohesive group, and from different parts of the world. So I'm thinking about the work in the Tall Consortium in Europe is a very important actor around this, but also the work that we are doing in ACRO as well. So how do we bring this together? How do we ensure that we are all aligned and we make our voices stronger? So yeah, I think this is what I will finish with. Obviously, there are like some next steps. I don't know if Claudio mentioned it before, I might have missed that the zero draft will be actually circulated. The zero draft of the outcome document will be circulated the week of the January 17th. That's the promise that the co-facilitator have done and told that the during the last day, during the closing remarks of the PrepCom. And there will also be a one-day session to present the zero draft on the week of the 22nd of January, obviously. The third PrepCom has been confirmed to be between the 10th and 14th of February in New York City. And yes, I think those are all the sort of like highlights. But yeah, over to you, Alessandra.
Thank you so much, Federica. Indeed, again, we are facing a very complex moment, but I tend to think that if we move with the demand for having goals, to have indicators, that could be the transformative piece. If we are not able to move on in the way you'd like to see things moving on in terms of new language or agreements. Because even if we take a look in Monterrey, the basic one, it's not a weak document. It's a very good base. But if we can repeat the language, but then having the goals and indicators, that could perhaps speed a little bit the process. Because what we have seen really at the UN process is that perhaps sometimes we can even get the good language, but the implementation remain for us in the field the main challenge. So the point for us is how to push further for the implementation in the territories. So this is one issue. The second point, it's really about the intel. And that's great, Federica, that we brought this information about mapping out who was strong or weak in providing more emphasis on gender. And then I think that the work that needs to follow is how and what could be, which will be the strategic countries for us to intensify our advocacy work, so in the next round they could be more vocal also on health and gender, so we can also strategize on that. And perhaps we could move on in January to develop some key messages together with some rationale. Why do we need to have those two issues linked in this conference? In particular, we have been really emphasizing the issue of care economy, because when I personally look into all this conversation, I can't see any other revolutionary approach than really bringing care economy to the field. It could be revolutionary because it can transform the way economy is. It can be revolutionary because it can transform relationships between women and men in the care responsibility and the responsibility of states. And we all know why it is a revolutionary, but I think at least to keep pushing for more practical approach, I think those could be something equally important. My main concern is also about the debt conversation, because I think the debt for health idea is an amazing idea, because it's very practical way of addressing, as Claudio mentioned, this is not to solve the issue of debt, but it could be an innovative approach for us to raise more money for health and let's say, why not gender as well. But what I'm concerned about this conversation, and perhaps I'd like to hear a little bit more from your perspectives on that, is we need to be really careful to not divide our movements on that. The moment we start advocating for that to health, and then that to climate change, and that, so we need to be wise at this moment and not allow this conversation to split us. Otherwise, all those movements that at the end of the day are fighting for the human rights approach, which is the only approach that could leave no one behind, we could jeopardize ourselves by fighting each other for this debt to health initiative. So these are also some of the concerns that I have at this moment. And my last comment before opening the floor, so you can raise your hands from now on to put some questions to Claudio and Federica. My last point is more like an invitation to all of us. I think the racial component, it's key for this conversation, and it's also key for the transformative approach. For Latin America and the Caribbean, issues around Black population, indigenous population, we have seen, and it is a completely disaster in all fields. You name it, I can give you an indicator and the data that shows it is a disaster. So we understand there are some key countries that do not have that kind of concern, perhaps because in some way they are more affected by migration in general, and in their, let's say, national laws, societies are more equal, let's say that. But I think even for economy, if those groups are able to get into economy in the traditional way, that could also benefit the entire spillover of, a warming economy and bringing more players to participate and to have a piece. So I think that in this context of how to fight for economic democracy at this stage in humanity, we need to really be wise and strategic on how we will continue this approach. I think we just have a few months ahead for this process. But now I'd like to invite our colleagues, please raise your hands, put your questions. No question is a silly question. If you have doubt about the process, also, I think we have two experts here ready to respond. Please come in. Don't be shy. Yvonne, please go ahead.
Yeah, I can't find the raise hand signal. So thank you, Alessandra. I was wondering how the US position, if there's anything changing, what you can see there in the second PrepCom, and what do you expect to happen next year? It's a big question,
Thank
I
you.
realize, but I think an important one because they have a big leverage in the whole dynamics of the meeting.
Definitely, Yvonne. Let me see if I have someone else that would like to put some question. No. So with that, I will give the floor to Claudio and Federica to make their comments and also perhaps the final comments because you have more 10 minutes. But we can go a little bit longer in your answers. And just to let you know that I was interested to see this week. I think yesterday Trump gave his first interview for everyone, and he said that he will increase the tariffs from imports, including from Brazil, and with that he plans to make the US a very rich country. So I don't know what to say about Trump. I know what to say about Trump. I'm just kidding. But with that, I'll give the floor to Claudio and Federica to make the comments.
Do you want to go first, or should I go first?
Go first, Federica. Let's begin with you.
Yeah, thanks, Alessandra. Thanks, Yvonne. Around the US, the statements that they gave, I think in terms of genderless, they didn't really, there was a mission, I mean, at least the ones that I've attended and I managed to listen to, they weren't as strong on gender. And I think it felt to me that it was more to kind of like make some, to be cautious about what is coming next. Obviously, the ones attending this PrepCom are not the ones, are still from the, correct me if I'm wrong, Claudia, but are still from the old administration. So what is going to happen at the third PrepCom, I'm not sure. And to be honest, I'm not sure how the difference will be managed. You know, the difference between these two will be managed during the third PrepCom. I don't know. I could sense some, yes, they were being very cautious about what they were saying in terms of gender and like not exposing themselves too much. But this might be just my personal feeling. I don't know. What do you think, Claudio?
Claudio,
you sorry?
I just want to confirm. Só queria confirmar se Rosana pediu o floor. Pediu para falar, Rosana?
It was because it popped up on here, like she was saying, good morning.
Sim, eu gostaria de falar. Meu nome é Rosane, eu participo de 2 coletivos, né? Eu sou uma mulher negra, neurodivergente, com altas habilidades. Eu participo de 2 coletivos. Eu participo de um coletivo de servidores e servidoras negras, né? Empregados públicos federais, e participo de uma rede de mulheres negras em combate à violência. E quando vocês falam no final, eu acho que é importante, quando falamos de América Latina e como falamos de Caribe e África, é a questão de gênero e raça é fundamental, eles não se separam, né? Principalmente quando falamos da economia, do aquecimento da economia do cuidado, né? Quem são essas mulheres que trabalham nessa economia do cuidado? São mulheres negras, são mulheres indígenas, são mulheres migrantes, refugiadas, né? Por mais que tentem fecharem a fronteira, eu acho que a migração também mexe com a economia dos Estados Unidos e com a economia europeia, as grandes economias. E aí eu fico pensando, nessa atual conjuntura, quando falamos de economia do cuidado, qual a perspectiva dessas mulheres trabalhadoras racializadas, né? Qual a perspectiva de trabalho com todas as garantias trabalhistas, né? Porque a gente, quando fala de trabalho, né, quando não é um trabalho branco, hétero, né, normativo, ele é um trabalho que ele é qualificado, ele é um trabalho bem pago. Mas quando falamos de uma economia de cuidado, e essa economia do cuidado ela está ligada muito à saúde, à educação, e o cuidado mesmo com a gente tem uma questão do envelhecimento global, como se a gente vai falar desse financiamento, dessa mobilidade dessas mulheres? Porque falar de economia do cuidado, sem falar isso, eu acho muito vago. A gente não está falando, né? Economia do cuidado também leva ao desenvolvimento, ele também tem impacto na economia. Eu queria entender que vocês pensam, qual a perspectiva.
Obrigada, Rosana. Sandra también pidió la palabra, entonces voy a pasar antes para Sandra, ¿ok, Claudio? Sandra, por favor, bienvenida.
Então, gente, olá, eu sou Sandra Munhoz, coordenadora da Casa Marielle Franco, uma casa que acolhe mulheres em situação de violências, né, para nós LGBT aqui no Brasil. E é também na linha, né, que a Alessandra falou, né? A gente não pode deixar de fazer um processo sem a gente falar dessas questões, né? Racial, né, econômico. Porque quando você fala de financiamento, essas coisas, aqui no Brasil tem uma coisa, né? É a nova coisa, né, as mulheres empreendedoras, né? Tudo é empreendedorismo hoje, né? Então as mulheres também ficam nesse processo da falsa venda do empreendedorismo. Então, como que a gente vai discutir também, né, nesse processo, né, que eu fico muito preocupada com isso, não que eu ache ruim quem faz, né? As entidades que fazem, tem mulheres que conseguem fazer esse processo, mas a gente ainda não consegue, né, nesse processo que essas mulheres estão vivendo. Né, aqui na Casa Marielle, a gente agora está recebendo refugiados e a gente, né, imigrantes, né? A gente vê tanta dificuldade que a gente tem, né? E a gente precisa de estar nesse processo de como que a gente também, assim, que quando as pessoas elas não são do nosso país, a dificuldade que a gente também tem de encaixar essas pessoas nesses trabalhos. Então, igual a Rosana, né, acabou de falar isso aí, essas pessoas elas ficam no processo de mão de obra barata. Né? É aquela pessoa que está lá, você pode ver que tem aquela placa, né, para quem vem no Brasil, essas coisas de venda de ouro, né, nas avenidas. Quem são aquelas pessoas que estão com aquelas placas? São pessoas que, na verdade, ficam ali o dia inteiro, né, às vezes até com fome, para trabalhar, para ganhar uma merreca. Então, acho que a gente também precisa discutir. E esse processo também de financiamento, essas coisas, a gente precisa, porque as mulheres, elas, né, fazem um processo muito grande, né? Porque elas que cuidam, assim, né, do processo da casa. Então, a gente precisa, na verdade, que essas mulheres, que eu acho que fico pensando assim, para as imigrantes que vêm nesse processo, e a gente não pode esquecer das indígenas também, né? Que vêm nesse processo de fazer esse trabalho, como que a gente vai fazer esse diálogo? Né? Porque, como por exemplo, quem são essas mulheres? E não estou aqui criticando nada, não, tá? Quem são esse grupo de mulheres que vão para Sevilha, por exemplo, em 2025? Qual que é o público dessas mulheres que chegou até lá? Né? Então, a gente também precisa de ouvir essas mulheres, tá? Obrigada. Grande Alessandra, beijo.
Obrigada, querida. Então, Cláudio, você tem a fala, e se Federica também e se Federica também quiser complementar, fica à vontade, confundindo aqui os idiomas.
Thank you, Alessandra. You asked me to speak in English, so okay, I will do that. Quick on the U.S. position. The U.S. position is very non-committal, okay? And as a matter of fact, I wrote down here with some explanation, with some underline, that in the last session, the U.S. in the monitoring follow-up section, the U.S. asked for sex disaggregated data. That was the only one that they asked for. So they did not get into the whole gender. After Saudi Arabia said, oh, we should not discuss language that has not been approved, such as gender. Then the US kind of changed its position and did not mention gender anymore, it mentioned sex. And that was the last position. I was being very keen to certain things in what these countries were saying throughout the meeting. And this was a change that I noted here. So in overall, the position of the US is very non-binding, okay? Every time the US speaks, they speak to the fact that the UN is a non-binding mechanism that you can discuss for a long time, but that does not necessarily indicate a change in national policies, in that every country has its sovereignty to change its national policy. So it all comes down to national advocacy. Essentially, that's what it comes down to. So in the sense of gender, the advocacy needs to be done in the capitals, and the countries need to bring to the zero draft discussion, which is going to be the February session, okay, from 12 to 14, the points that those countries need to defend. So civil society, I would say, in this January to February, would be very, let's say, you would optimize its advocacy work if there is a decentralized capital attack, let's put it this way. You know what I mean? Like every advocacy group in their own country advocating their capitals about the Financing for Development Conference and making that reach the missions and not necessarily reaching the missions. Because it's quite interesting. I even responded here to Guilhermina, for instance, how the capital is influencing a lot the missions, okay, in the PrepCom. At this time in New York, there was a problem because it was close to a holiday, the Thanksgiving holiday. So hotels were so expensive, and a lot of the capital people did not go to New York because of that. That also affected a little bit what happened in the second PrepCom, because in the first one, actually, the capitals were involved of the countries, okay? So national, and then in the international scenario, map out some of the countries, definitely like, you know, Canada, Brazil, you know, the UK, Switzerland. The UK has been changing, you know, a little bit its position since labor changed. So it's been, but always in the liberal developed country type of position. So now what was brought up about women, indigenous population, I have to actually take note of Canada has come with a lot of indigenous speech. Canada is going through a mea culpa nationally. And so Canada also was one of the only countries actually to bring indigenous population in that position. Brazil brought Afro-descendants, but not indigenous per se. But that's something that also needs to be mobilized, I would say, capitals, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean countries, you know, national advocacy on the capitals to make it visible. As Alessandra said, the whole idea of the indicators is kind of a subliminal strategy to bring those issues if they can be part of the indicators menu, let's put it this way. So then each country can monitor FFD in their national boundaries, and that's strategic. So I think that also needs to be brought up more. And then as the last sister talked about, Sandra Munoz, She said, you know, women that enterprise, small business is important, but then to leverage small business, you need a different type of support as well. So that's kind of important part. But on the care economy, where we can really connect the dots is in the social protection floor and universal basic income. And those are two things that it came out very few times. I don't even remember actually who talked anything about that. But social protection floor is something that it was part of financing for development before in a very strong way. And now, at least during the meeting, was not very strong. Okay, it's been recognized in the elements paper, but the whole thing is that's how care economy can be connected. It's social protection floor, universal basic income. And as far as representation of women, then we should have a meeting about that, as particularly Latin American, Caribbean, you know, women's movement, because there was a crack in the women's representation within the FFD civil society mechanism. And I don't know if you're aware, Federica, but then we can talk, you know, more specifically about what that I witnessed that thing happening, and that's why there is a vacuum in pretty much in women's representation. And as far as the racial representation, very important. Gala Des now it's part of the process, but other Latin American, Caribbean organizations and European organizations and Indian organizations, you know, because the whole race thing, it's beyond also the Afro-descendant, and indigenous populations are everywhere in every country too, in most of the countries, and they suffer similar conditions. But I hope I answered that. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. I will give the floor to Guillermina and then Federica.
Thank you, Alessandra. Hi, everyone. I first of all, I want to agree with everything that has been said, and particularly what Alessandra said. I think that in all the issues, we have to be more united than ever. We can't afford to have any issues that separate civil society or makes us fight. We have to find common grounds. We also have to find, because that's the only chance we have. And I say that, and now I'm going to talk more as an Argentinian woman and not from my organization, but the Argentinian situation, it's really bad. All of our foreign affairs staff members have been ordered to not support or agree on anything that says gender equality, Agenda 2030, climate change, human rights. So, and that applies to everyone. And it's a direct order from the president. So I don't see it can get worse in any way. So advocating on our own government right now, it's difficult, and it's also a bit dangerous, not in a personal way, but we have certain rights that are guaranteed by laws. But right now, most of that, the way they're jumping that rights is by not financing them. For example, health. The national budget presented to Congress a while ago, when you look at the health budget for next year, it's in some cases like HIV, 75% less than we have. So that means it's nothing. So that means, okay, they don't have the numbers in Congress to go back with the rights that we have by law. But if you don't finance those rights and the access to those services, it's kind of the same way. Next year, Argentina has midterm elections. So that's going to be a major issue too, because if the government's party gets the majority of votes that they need in Congress, that is going to become very dangerous for women and minorities. So in some cases, again, I speak of myself, because this is not that I participated in dialogues with too many organizations, but in some cases, we're just trying to like survive and make sure that they don't go back with the law and the recognitions of the rights. Because for the funding, we're trying to get funding from other places and try to see how we keep the services going, but at least we haven't lost our legal rights, which is something that we really have to try not to do. And that's why it's so difficult. And we're afraid that if we make too much noise, then they'll go for the legal rights. And that's going to get even worse. So that's kind of like the situation in Argentina. And the last thing I wanted to comment about is I agree about the indigenous, the Black communities and everything. But I think that if we talk about racial issue, that includes every single country. Because migration, which is something that's happening in most of our countries too, it's also related to racial issues, right? I mean, it has to, at the end of the day, it has to do with racial issues. So maybe that's a wording that includes everyone without having to mention, which it would be great. But in this context, and what's happening also with migrants in many, many countries that are going more to the right than usual, maybe it's easier to push for racial issues, considerations, and not mention each one of the communities that we know are highly affected by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermina. Thank you for update us about Argentina. We wish you the best. We went through Bolsonaro in Brazil, so you have all solidarity from us here as well. And with that, I'll give the floor to Gisele and then to Federica. Sorry, Federica. Gisele, por favor, pode falar.
Olá, bom dia, boa tarde a todas as pessoas presentes. Eu sou Gisele dos Anjos, do CERT, que é o Centro de Estudos das Relações de Trabalho e Desigualdades, organização do movimento negro brasileiro, que atua já há mais de 34 anos em prol da equidade racial e de gênero. E eu gostaria de fazer algumas colocações antes de fazer a minha pergunta, no sentido de dizer que eu tenho total concordância, né, com o que foi dito sobre a importância dos indicadores, a necessidade de a gente trazer uma perspectiva interseccional que valorize e compreenda, né, a interação da opressão de gênero e de raça em todos os países, como foi dito, mas gostaria de pontuar aqui que eu discordo dessa noção de que a gente não deva identificar os grupos, né, como povos indígenas, população negra, uma vez que o processo de invisibilidade é uma das marcas e um dos mecanismos do racismo. Então, acho que a gente precisa sim dizer população negra, povos indígenas, imigrantes e todos os outros grupos que precisam ser nomeados nesse sentido. Mas não dizer, como a Guilhermina sugeriu agora, eu acho que seria uma questão. Mas a pergunta que eu gostaria de trazer aqui é com relação à CSW 69, que vai acontecer, bom, como sempre acontece anualmente, vai acontecer em março. Eu queria saber como, de alguma forma, tanto Cláudio como a Federica relacionam esses eventos e a possibilidade, inclusive, de trazer alguns debates que vão estar na Precon, como esse evento em Sevilha, também na nossa incidência na CSW, não sei quais organizações aqui pretendem participar, o CERT vem participando nesses últimos anos, e eu acho que, inclusive, seria válido a gente pensar maneiras de fazer isso de forma conjunta para fortalecer, né, a nossa atuação. É isso, obrigada.
Obrigada, Gisele. Antes de passar, então, para a Federica, só para comentar que esse tema da FFD está completamente no radar de todas as organizações feministas que estão se articulando para a CSW. A ONU Mulheres, aqui há 2 semanas atrás, aqui no Chile, na consulta que foi feita para Beijing, e justamente em preparação para a CSW, ressaltou isso, todos os governos estão ressaltando. Eu tenho a impressão que nunca houve uma atração tão grande pela FFD como agora. Eu tenho a impressão que as pessoas realmente começaram, e os movimentos sociais começaram a prestar mais atenção nessa FFD. Eu acho que tem mais novos grupos se engajando nesse processo da FFD do que antes. E o que nós, pelo menos aqui na IPPF Acro, estamos pensando em fazer para a CSW é justamente fazer um evento paralelo que se chama Financiamento para os Direitos das Mulheres, nessa perspectiva do on the road, no caminho para a FFD. Então, não temos mais como discutir nem a CSW, nem a CPD, sem falar nos meios de implementação. E os meios de implementação são debatidos na FFD. Então, eu acho que a gente precisa cada vez mais fazer esse esforço de colar e entender que essas agendas são estruturantes, de novo, convidando todo mundo a participar, porque a gente às vezes pensa que não pode falar sobre economia porque não é economista, mas todo mundo pode falar sobre economia, todo mundo de várias maneiras lida com isso. Eu acho que por isso que esses webinários que a gente está fazendo tão importantes, porque a gente realmente gostaria de ir ajudando a criar e a fortalecer esse movimento. Então, com isso, eu passo para a Federica e vou deixar para a Federica fazer as palavras finais. Se Cláudio tiver mais algum comentário a fazer, vou pedir para ele fazer. Tem mais um, então depois da Federica eu passo para a Cláudia. E aí a gente conclui a sessão. Federica, por favor.
Thanks, Alessandra. This is all great questions and input, and thanks for sharing your experience and what you're going through as well. I just had a few sort of like comments on some of the things that have been said. First of all, yes, I just wanted to reiterate, linking back to what Giselle has just asked about, how we connect all these processes. And I think that this is such an important point, just not, it's already hard for us that we sort of like know that these processes are connected to kind of like keep track of all of them. So we need to make a bigger effort to ensure that we're not considering them as silos and as separate processes, and to really highlight the connection. And as Alessandra, and I also wanted to mention this, as IPPF, we're really trying to address that specifically with CSW. I had a CSW in March, ensuring that we bring up this finance element as well from that forum. So I just urge everyone to just like keep that in mind also when talking about this. Keep in mind this connection between processes, which I think is vital to ensure that our asks and progresses specifically around gender and SRHR are really going somewhere. And then on the other thing that I wanted to mention, and it goes back to the implementation, the need for implementation, sort of like measure and indicators. I think that's such a key point. And from what I could gather from conversation with others, this is really what we need. Going back to my to what I was saying before about practical recommendation, this is the sort of practical recommendation that member states, delegations are really looking for. And this is such a vital, I really want to reiterate this point, and hopefully we can find ways to really ensure that it's reflected or is brought up a member state, with the delegation in this sort of like process that will lead to the zero draft and then in the negotiation process. And then lastly, in terms of the coordinated approach, I totally agree with what Claudia said in terms of like being really intentional and also like, really focus on advocacy at national level, but really that should come from a coordinated approach between all of us at different, in different areas. So really ensuring that the messaging across obviously different countries and different regions, it's aligned specifically on gender and SRHR, and then really brought up at national level in with the delegations in the UN, in this UN space. So lastly, also on the social protection element, I think Claudio was referring to this. I totally agree. This wasn't really strong. During the PrepCom, I think there was just one event organized by ILO and I think it was UN Women, on social protection. But again, I feel there is a bit of disconnect. And so how do we bring them on and ensure that, social protection language specifically for the outcome document could also be helpful for, our objectives and vice versa. So really, how we build relationship with these allies that and really address the gaps and really have a coordinated approach also on these sort of like other issues as well. So just wanted to finish with these remarks.
Thank you very much, Federica. And now, Claudio, for your last comment, please.
Thank you, Ale, and totally agree, Federica. Fantastic. When you mentioned CSW, while I was in New York 2 weeks ago, what I thought was two things. One is civil society could propose, in this case, IPPF, possibly, and with some other countries like Canada, a side event for the PrepCom 3 on gender and the care economy and what that means. Because also something I realized is that most of the times the country's representative and the missions, they have a position on gender, but they do not really know what they're talking about. They really take from this, kind of a scary monster gender ideology thing that was created before, and they don't really know what they're talking about and why is it important to actually differentiate, particularly in the care economy. It was somebody mentioned before, I don't remember, maybe Rosani was, or somebody else mentioned elderly people, the care economy of elderly people and how that works, and also how actually different gender have different demands. And that creates vulnerability when those demands are not, fulfilled, they're not supplied. So that's one idea is that one would be a side event at the FFD3, and following what Gisele was talking about on CSW, should be a side event on CSW about FFD and the care economy and the possibility of the care economy and the demand for the care economy to be part of this new index beyond GDP, which then it goes back to the whole circle of indicators being a way of bringing into visibility, the participation of different sectors of the population. And the last thing is, one more time, reinforcing the importance of, as far as visibility goes, and somebody commented here, the indigenous population and the presence everywhere also needs to be reinforced. So it goes to the microeconomics of things. That's what when I first spoke, which is like, okay, how do you get some of those big monies, even if they bring the big monies, okay, and the banks are full of monies and the World Bank is full of money and everything. How do you actually direct those resources to these groups where they can create and leverage their own economies? There was an event that was organized by Gelades, a side event was organized by Gelades, and one of the things that I brought about was, I quoted the wrong city. I said St. Louis, but in fact it was Tucson, Arizona, where in 1931, where there was a Black community of 30,000 people that had their own economy. And their economy was very pungent and it was very strong. And there was a racial destruction of that economy. And something else that many times needs to be brought about in the discussion, and that was something that I raised, is the whole hegemony of white supremacy. So it's still very much underlying a lot of the discussions on FFD. Somebody else here talked about, the jobs for the white male, Yeah, that's very much still present, There's still the disadvantage in the economic aspects of particularly, women of color, let's put it this way, of different colors, of different races in all over the world, compared to white women, and then white women compared to white men and all that. So yeah, I'll finish with here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claudio. I think you gave us an excellent idea, which is to try to put together a side event for the third PrepCom. And I think, of course, that this is something that interested a lot to Justus and also to IPPF. So Federica, let's follow up on that after, because I think this conversation, gender health, for us in IPPF is absolutely strategic. So we cannot lose also the health perspective, because this is what we do, but also the gender perspective is something that you can have from the beginning to the end with this racial and human rights approach and perspectives. With that, I'd like to thank you, all of you who participated today. We will have a preparation for the PrepCom, a call for preparing for the PrepCom, the third PrepCom in February. And meanwhile, we can come up with some key messages to work in the capital. We will also keep you informed. And with that, I also like to wish you an excellent new year. And I hope you take some days to rest and to charge your batteries, because next year will be very challenged and we need to be as united as possible, as together as possible. So thank you so much. And particular thank you to you, Claudio and Federica. It was amazing conversation, and I hope everyone is much more informed now. Thank you. From IPPF Acro, we thank you, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alessandra.
Take care.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Claudio.
Thank you. Let's talk more.
Gracias. Ciao. Hello.
Bye.